Okay, this is Masood Roshan, and I'm representing the Association of Iranica in Australasia. And I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you for attending to our first of the Iranica Association lecture series of 2024. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the indigenous people of first Aotearoa in New Zealand and also Australasia, and indigenous people of all nations around the world. And also, before the opening, let me mention the Association of Iranica is an association which is based in Australia, most of our activities, and it was established in 2004. And it is a non-profit, non-political, non-religious, and non-partisan politics organizations. And our main focus has been promotion of cultural heritage of Iran and Persianate cultures. And to that effect, we have held many conferences, live conferences, mainly in Australia, in Sydney especially. And then since COVID, we had continued our activities in form of virtual lecture series, which have been successful. And some of them have been even collaborative projects, like collaboration with Australian National University in 2020 and 2021, which was held and invited a wide audience from around the world, and many from Iran, many scholars from Iran contributed to that. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our first lecture for this year. Let me just mention a few words about our guest speaker and the topics that is presented. Tonight we have a presentation by Dr. James White, who is a lecturer in Persian studies at Oxford University. And his research focuses on the multilingualism and the social uses of poetry in the Middle East and South Asia during the late medieval and early modern periods. And his doctoral thesis, which was completed in 2018 from Oxford University, was concerned with the formation of bilingual, mainly Arabic and Persian literary cultures in medieval Khorasan region. And his subsequently worked on a second research project in Arabic and Persian literature network, which was completed at the University of Freie at Berlin. And again, it was concentrated on the medieval Persian literature. And his topic tonight is the book, his recently published book with the same title, Persian and Arabic Literary Communities in the 17th Century and Migrant Poets between Arabia, Iran, and India. And this book has been published by Bloomsbury in 2023. And we also have pleasure to have our discussant, Pravan Prakash, and he's a junior research fellow at Christ Church, an associate faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oxford. He's also a senior fellow of the Andrew Mellon Society of Fellows in critical comparative study of literature, literary cultures, religious traditions, and book arts in the Persian and South Asian section of the several fellowships. He has had several fellowships and grants, and he's supported his research on the history of archives, collections, craft communities, and printed ephemeral in India, Iran, and Central Asia. And of course, he has a website that we can refer to his profile in more detail. So tonight we are going to have the pleasure of presentation by Dr. James White, and here he's going to start his presentation, and then after he completes his presentation, we have the Q&A session, which will be moderated by Pravan Prakash. Thank you very much, Dr. White. It's all yours.
Thank you, Masood, and thank you, Pranav, and thank you, everyone, for coming. It's an honor to be with you today. I'm just going to briefly stop sharing my video and start my screen. So hopefully you can see my presentation. Would you mind confirming that you can see it?
Yes, yes.
Excellent. Okay. So my recent book, Persian and Arabic Literary Communities, explores how Iran, India, and the Arabian Peninsula became connected to one another during the 17th century through the production and circulation of poetry. Authors who migrated from one state to another acted as the motors of a trans-regional literary system, adapting shared poetic forms, imagery, and rhetoric to engage with other writers and create communities in the cities where they settled, thereby linking textual production in their old and new homes. The book begins by reconstructing overarching patterns in the movement of over 1,000 authors and the economic basis for their migration, before focusing on 6 case studies of literary communities, which each represent a different location in the circulatory system of the Arabian Sea. Today, I'd like to show you how I've used biographical anthologies of poetry, or tazkires, in conjunction with manuscripts of poets' collected works, divans, preserved in libraries in India, Iran, Turkey, and Europe, to reconstruct how 17th century literature became so worldly. And I'll also consider some of the methodological challenges that I've encountered. I'm just going to be focusing on the Persian side, so feel free to ask questions at the end about Arabic. So firstly, some background. Throughout the 17th century, migration between India and Iran was a key feature of Persian literary life. A foundational study of early modern migration is Ahmad Golchine Ma'ani's Karavan-e-Hind, or The Caravan Bound for India. This biographical dictionary of poets who left Iran for South Asia between the late medieval period and the 18th century combs through many texts in order to create as expansive a source book as possible, identifying 353 poets who migrated eastwards in the long 17th century, from the accession of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir in 1605 to the death of the Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707. Migration was not a new phenomenon. From the early 11th century, when Lahore became a major political center of the Ghazanid Empire, Persian literary production began to flourish throughout South Asia, in contexts ranging from courts to Sufi lodges and fortified villages. Throughout the medieval period and into the early modern era, movement from Iran and Central Asia to India followed many routes, including not just to the north, but also to the Deccan. The migration of speakers of Persian to India led to the creation of transnational political and religious structures and to the investment of economies in one another. A good example of this phenomenon is the Qutb-Shahi Sultanate of Hyderabad in modern-day India, whose royal family traced their origins to the early 15th century Turkic Karakoyunlu rulers of Tabriz and Baghdad. The dynasty's links with Iran were continuous and ongoing, and the name of the Shah of Iran was traditionally pronounced before the name of the Shah at Friday prayers in Golconda. Even in the 17th century, many of the state's principal officers were migrants from Iran, including the Prime Minister, or Mir Jamleh, Mir Mohammad Sa'id Ardostani, who had spent his early life in Esfahan, and Niknam Khan, Commander-in-Chief of Golconda's military. Safavid Iran invested heavily in Golconda's economy and was one of its major trading partners. Now, past scholarship has tended to emphasize questions of society and ideology when discussing the migration of poets from Iran to India in the early modern period. Modern commentators have claimed that the Safavids only patronized religious panegyrics, effectively ending traditional structures and forcing budding Iranian poets to seek support in South Asia. The data, though, would tend to indicate something quite different. The poetry was actually very popular in Safavid Iran, and that when poets decided to travel to India, they did so only because they could earn even more in South Asia. Economic questions of how and how much 17th century poets earned from the sale of their work are key to understanding the process of migration during this period. Equivalent institutions of patronage in Iran and India, a common legal infrastructure, financial mobility, and relatively affordable transport encouraged poets to travel and made the Western Indian Ocean one large theatre of opportunity, actively connecting cities in different states. Safavid Iran had a robust market for poetry in Esfahan and in provincial centers like Mashhad, and poets' earnings could be substantial when compared with the salaries of other professions. However, higher stipends and gifts of value, lower living costs, and an even greater number of centers of literary production in India encouraged poets to travel there. To migrate was not to abandon one's former life. Actually, the ability to remit wealth to dependents who had stayed behind would have made it tempting for families to hedge their bets and send their members in different directions. Many poets also only traveled to India for a short time before returning to Iran. This is a leaf from an autographed manuscript of a work called Tazkireh Nasrabadi, or Nasrabadi's biographical anthology, which was completed in 1676 by a writer called Muhammad Tahir Nasrabadi. Nasrabadi lived in and around Esfahan, which had become the capital of Safavid Iran. Over the course of his life, Nasrabadi became a very prominent member of the Safavid literary scene, mostly as an essayist, an editor, and as an arbiter of good taste. His renown as a literary figure had grown. He established a coffee house behind the mosque at Lon Ban in a suburb of Esfahan, where people would seek him out on their visits to the Safavid capital. In so doing, he became an important node in a network of poets that expanded across West, Central, and South Asia. In middle age, Nasrabadi decided to bring together his experiences, his notes, and his memories, and to produce a written record of the state of Persian poetry in his own era, preserving the lives of the poets for posterity. The result is his Tazkireh, which contains entries on roughly 900 poets who were active between about 1600 and 1675. Of these, around 10% were acquaintances that Nasrabadi tells us he met. Possible that he actually met many more, but he explicitly mentions having encountered just under 90 of them. These friends then transmitted information about other poets to Nasrabadi, corroborating biographies and offering alternative sources for lines of poetry. The result is a text that is rooted in exchanges that happened in Esfahan, but which actually expands to encompass poets who traveled through Iraq, Syria, North India, and the Deccan, and even as far away as Ethiopia and Europe. And to my mind, the Tazkireh is a fantastic source that we can use to harness and to understand how social connections between poets generated intertextual poems. I tend to think about Nasr Abadi as two things: a textual scholar who was fascinated by poetry and who wanted to translate it, and as a sociologist who was curious about other people's lives and their characters. We have to balance these two aspects of his project if we want to understand his aims. On screen, you can see the professions of the poets who are mentioned by Nasr Abadi. The first thing to note is quite how many people were writing poetry in the 17th century, how verse brought people from very different professions and walks of life together. Nasr Abadi has entries on 213 professional poets, that is, poets who derived their income primarily through writing poetry. But the bulk of the authors who are mentioned actually worked in other professions, as members of the religious establishment, for example, as state officials. Many of them were involved in trade or worked as artisans and craftsmen. It's important to bear in mind that Tazkireh Nasr Abadi is the work of an individual and depends on the anthologist's unique perspective. So obviously it doesn't list every poet who was writing in the 17th century. What it does do, however, and do very well, is to map out a community of writers who were connected to one another socially. Nasr Abadi really stands at the center of his anthology, and his Tazkireh takes the Safavid capital of Isfahan, in whose surroundings he grew up and spent most of his life, as its unstated point of exchange. Cities that were in close proximity to the capital, such as Shiraz, Yazd, Qam, and Kashan, feature prominently, as do Mashhad and Tabriz. Relatively little space is given to non-Iranian poets who migrated inwards to Iran, even though there were many writing in Persian, or those who remained outside Iran and never visited it. And those who are included came to the anthologist's attention directly or through his sources. Many of these personal contacts were well-traveled, and they brought with them their own networks, meaning that there are minimal degrees of separation between the anthologist and the vast majority of his subjects. Nasr Abadi also leveraged the connections that he had made when he did Hajj to Mecca and his family links to India when he was composing his anthology. His paternal grandfather had settled at the court of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, and one of his uncles and one of his nephews were in India at the time of the anthology's composition. As I've already mentioned, Nasr Abadi was fascinated by both people and poetry, and he went to great lengths to find and preserve the texts composed by his contemporaries. Given that only a small number of 17th century divans have been print published in modern times, Nasr Abadi's work is a very important early source for understanding the textual history of the corpus. Having said that, though, there are particular things about Nasr Abadi's approach that make working with his Tazkireh complicated. For starters, his critical approach is rooted in individual images and rhetorical devices, so he does not give poems in their entirety, only isolated lines extracted from different pieces. You can see that on screen with this extract from Nasr Abadi's entry on the poet Mirza Fasihi, whose divan has been published in a print edition by Ibrahim Qaisari. Some of Nasr Abadi's entries include just a single line of poetry. There's up to 60, with each line generally being drawn from a different poem. Unlike some other early modern Persian biographical anthologies, such as Taqi Kashi's Khulasat al-Ash'ar, which contains very extensive selections from the work of each biographical subject and is an enormously useful source of poetry, Tazkireh Nasr Abadi actually invites readers, whether in the 17th century or now, to use it as a kind of catalogue, which must be read in conjunction with divans through a process of referencing and cross-referencing. Nasr Abadi also doesn't tell us much about his methods, so it's difficult to know whether he compared different manuscripts of poets' work. Obviously, textual or literary culture at the time was entirely dependent on manuscripts, or whether he drew his quotations from a single best text. In some cases, I've had to use two quite different manuscripts of a poet's divan in conjunction in order to recover the full complement of lines by them which Nasrabadi cites. At least once he talks about having seen a particular poet's verse as collected in Iran. He calls it the Divan-e-Iran, implying that authors place differing editions of their poetry into circulation at different stages in their careers and at different points on their migrations. So even though the Tazkireh is a fantastic source for examining how poets were connected to one another, but also how styles and motifs spread, we can't rely on it by itself if we want to expand the project that Nasrabadi started and see how social connections between poets construct literary texts. This is why I consulted a large number of manuscripts as part of my research for the book. Here are some examples on screen, selections from the divans of some major 17th century poets whose work is still unfortunately unpublished. On the right, we have the divan of Sa'aduddin Muhammad Raqam, the governor of Mashhad. In the middle is the divan of Saleh Yazdi, who left Iran and traveled extensively in India. On the left is the divan of Elahi, a poet from Hamadan who also left Iran and to India. One of the major challenges involved in this kind of work is locating the manuscripts, which are held in different countries, and then bringing images of them together for comparison. However, when we can do this, we're able to reconstruct or reconstitute the world of literary borrowing and exchange in which 17th poets participated. So what do I mean by a world of borrowing and exchange? Well, here is an example from a 17th century notebook. Compilers carried their notebooks with them as they worked and traveled. Notes were therefore added to these manuscripts as their owners' thinking developed and as they met new people. Compilation of notebooks was often a sociable and performative process, with the owner inviting celebrities and friends to contribute their hands and their ideas to the codex. Mapping the extracts which writers included in their notebooks and understanding how the contents of these extracts changed as the compilers traveled allows us to understand the formation of communities. A number of early modern Persian notebooks survive in libraries around the world, but they are often described inadequately or misidentified in manuscript catalogues. 3 17th century notebooks, the first in the Sepah Salah Library in Tehran, the second in the British Library, and the third in the Central Library of the University of Tehran, were brought to scholarly attention by Mohammad Taqi Danish Paju in 1979. Danish Paju was principally interested in these volumes as samples of the hands of renowned 17th century Iranian scholars, and he regarded them as crucial sources for authenticating other holograph and autograph manuscripts. Beyond their most utilitarian applications, however, the manuscripts present promising avenues for research in community formation and language use. One of them in particular, the notebook of the merchant and literary dilettante Mirza Muhammad Fayaz, the brother of Muhammad Baqir Sabzavari, who died in 1979, casts light on the formation of Persian literary communities in the 17th century. This notebook is MS 9707 in the Central Library of the University of Tehran. Out of the 900 or so 17th century poets who are discussed in Nasrabadi's biographical anthology, almost 20% traveled to South Asia, with the majority visiting the Mughal Empire and a significant minority visiting the Qutb Sultanate. Fayaz seems to have spent quite some time in the Qutb domains. There are entries made in his notebook in Hyderabad in around 1645 and 1647. One further entry was made in the port of Mutulipatnam, which was the main port of the Qutb Sultanate, in 1647. It is most probable that Fayaz then made multiple trips between Iran and India as he met the great poet Sa'eb in Iran in 1649. He was in Shiraz in 1650 and back in India in the port of Surat in that same year, 1650. When he was in the Safavid Empire, Fayaz traveled widely, also visiting the cities of Harad and Mashhad and the capital at Esfahan. The notebook does not clarify Fayaz's reasons for traveling between Iran and India, but it seems most likely that he was motivated by a mixture of commercial, political, and personal interests. Some of the people who added their autographs to the book at Fayaz's request, were involved in the gold trade. They include Abdul Wasi Abbas, who was chief superintendent of the gold workshop, which produced jewelry for a daughter of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. And there are also two men called Kalba Ali Tabrizi and Hashidaya Zargar, both of whom are named in Nasrabadi's biographical anthologies as minor poets who earn their living in the gold business. It is certainly possible that Fayaz may have bought and sold gold internationally. The collected correspondence of a Shahi court secretary indicates that when Fayaz was in Golconda, he was hosted by a man called Nizamuddin Ahmad Gilani, the royal physician, another Iranian who had served for a time as the Shahi ambassador to the Safavids. So it's clear that Fayaz had access to courtly and diplomatic circles. Be that as it may, Fayaz was not simply interested in making political and commercial connections. His notebook shows very vividly that he tried to immerse himself in the intellectual life of the cities that he visited and to form networks with the scholars and poets whom he encountered. Migration was a central aspect of the lives of many 17th century writers and thinkers, and so Fayaz seized every opportunity that he got. He ran across the poet Khayal at the port of Surat in 1650 and asked him to inscribe this album. Similarly, he met the poet Johari at the port of Masulipatam in 1647. Both encounters may have been brief, with one party disembarking from a ship as the other waited to board. Alternatively, Fayaz may have become friendly with the poets while waiting for bad weather to clear. Either way, this evidence indicates that text production was not restricted to performative contexts such as courtly gatherings. Literary life spilled out into the public spaces, creating complex transnational networks which linked places together through the movement of people and the literature. This affects how we model the start and end points of cultural complexes. Now, when Fayaz visited Hyderabad between 1645 and 1648, he encountered two authors who were affiliated with the Qadshahi court and got them to inscribe his notebook with their autographs. One of these men was Salek Yazdi, whose divan I showed on screen earlier. Salek was an emigre poet from Iran who composed a few panegyrics for the Qadshahi Sultan Abdallah, but who found his greatest source of patronage in the form of the Prime Minister of Golconda, Mir Muhammad Saeed Ardestani. The Mir Jamleh's protection of Salek Yazdi would have made the poet a local notable who could have introduced Fayaz to Hyderabad's Persian literary scene. Salek inscribed 12 pages of this notebook with samples of his own Persian verse, introducing them with the phrase by the inscriber, Salek Yazdi, and ending with a colophon to the effect that he copied out the choir in September 1647 in the city of Hyderabad. In the same place in Hyderabad, Fayaz also met another poet named Faraj Allah Shushtari, a bilingual poet active at the court of the Shahs, both in Arabic and in Persian. Faraj Allah was also a religious scholar and a secretary. In one part of the notebook, Faraj Allah copied out a series of lyric poems in Persian by the minor 16th century poet Valiya Dasht Bayazi of in Khorasan. On another occasion, in 1645, Faraj Allah copied out a series of exegetical and legal passages for Fayaz. So, in his anthology, Nasrabadi has entries on both Faraj Allah Shushtari and Salek Yazdi. Manuscripts of their divans survive in libraries in Hyderabad and Tehran, and you can see two of those, selections from two of those manuscripts on screen. Although Nasrabadi mentions these two poets in conjunction with one another, he does not give us much of a sense of whether they influenced one another's work. But when we cross-read the manuscripts of their collected poetry, we find emulative connections that they established with one another's text. Two poems in particular allow us to explore how Faraj Allah and Salek constructed a literary connection with one another. More generally, these poems also provide an insight into concepts of creativity in the 17th century. We can be certain that these pieces represent a deliberate exchange because Salek ends his poem, which is on the right, with a direct quotation or tazmin. He says, "Faraj miguyad natavan burd az in khane be in khane naza." As Faraj says, one cannot take a dispute from this house to the next. The two pieces are lyric poems, or ghazals, showing the same rare rhyme and radif, repeated element, and the same meter, distinctive formal elements together. Here is my English translation of the two pieces. So the central idea of dispute, or neza, which features as the repeated radif in the poems, is developed into complementary ideas: the impossibility of contradicting what fortune has in store, a lover's quarrel, the irascibility of the drunkard, and the philosophical debate over truth. Each line in Salek's ghazal finds a clear antecedent in Faraj Allah's work, so that Salek's lines 1 to 9 correspond in order to Faraj Allah's lines 9, 6, 5, 4, 3, 1, 8, 1, and then the first line of another ghazal. There is a clear method to this progression. Salek begins with the end of Faraj Allah's poem, moving backwards, and then ends with a twist by referencing a different ghazal by Faraj. 3 lines from the original do not find responses in the imitation. Salek's engagement with Faraj Allah's imagery is designed to construct meaning out of his predecessor's work, and in this sense, his technique is almost exegetical. We can see this in Salek's line 2, corresponding with Faraj Allah's line 6, where Faraj Allah merely suggests the lover's drunken gaze at the beloved, but Salek builds a far more explicit and arguably far more vivid image of the beloved's eyes and hair fighting for the narrator's attention, like drunkards trying to gain control of a goblet. At the same time, Salek exercises enough latitude to make his images definitively his own and transforms Faraj Allah's piece into a text more easily recognizable love poem. So what are the two poets doing with this kind of dialogue? They're using intertextuality as a way to build social connections with one another to form a friendship, but they're also working together to build a new intellectual world in Hyderabad and to connect it with text in Iran. So to my mind, this is a very practical demonstration of what I mean by transnational community formation. Now, I've also encountered instances where there are no neat correspondences between Nasrabadi's anthology and manuscript divans. I think any literary historian who extends the purview of their research beyond materials which have been published in modern critical editions becomes aware that our entire impression of pre-modern authors' identities and their work depends on manuscript culture and its layers of interpretations. As the French critic Jean Bollec once said, it is impossible to build an interpretation based on the raw material without going through the history of interpretations. Not only can material aspects of the book, such as wormed pages and missing folios, lead to mistaken attributions of the wrong poet, but the record itself is the result of editorial choices made by scribes. This is not a problem that pertains exclusively to 17th century Persian literature, but the issue is exacerbated by the fact that only a minority of the collected works of the period have been print published, and that those as yet unpublished 17th century divans which do survive are often limited to 2 or 3 manuscripts per poet scattered across globally. I've experienced this problem a lot in trying to identify the work of a poet named Mir Lutf Allah Salem, who Nasrabadi tells us came from Kashmir to Esfahan. The problem is that there appear to have been 2 poets who both lived at the end of the 17th century, who both came from Kashmir and who were both called Salem. The second was called Haji Muhammad Aslam Salem, and he was the father of a biographer named Muhammad Aslah, who compiled a tazkira of poets from Kashmir. Aslam purportedly came from a family of Brahmins and converted to Islam under the Emperor Aurangzeb, who appointed him to serve his son, Prince Atzam Shah. After Aurangzeb's death, Atzam Shah very briefly became Mughal emperor for about 3 months in 1707 before he was killed. During this time, Aslam acted as one of Atzam Shah's court poets, as his Khana Saman, and as the superintendent of the imperial Mughal purchasing department. It's conceivable but unlikely that the two Salems were one and the same man. A recent convert who fabricated a Shi'i pedigree for himself when he visited the Safavid domains in his youth and who later returned to India. Nasrabadi makes no mention of Haji Muhammad Aslam and is our only source of information about Mir Lod Salah, and his account forms the basis of subsequent discussions of this. Haji Muhammad Aslam's son, Aslah, makes no identifiable mention of Mir Lod Salem in his own biographical anthology. Potentially, therefore, we could simply be seeing a single life interpreted in different ways by two different biographers, writing decades apart. But it was common for a single takhalos to be shared by more than one poet, and on the balance of probability, they were separate individuals. Due to their shared pen name and the fact that they must have been direct contemporaries, it is not always immediately clear which manuscripts catalogued as the Divan of Salem represent the collected works of which poet. While I'm not aiming to underplay the likelihood of mistaken identities when attempting to find and study the poetry of Mir Lod Allah, I judge the extant manuscripts of Salem's poetry now held in Oxford, Qom, and Rampur to all be the work of Haji Muhammad Aslam, primarily because none of the quotations from Mir Lod Allah's work that are found in Nasrabadi's Tazkirah are featured in these volumes. So we can think of this as an opportunity to identify where the boundaries of community can be thought to lie. If the poetry that is ascribed to Salem in the record engages with the work of Mir Lod Allah's interlocutors in Iran that was actually composed by Aslam in India, it provides an occasion to explore how the intertextual connections between contemporaries who lived at different ends of the Persian zone of circulation differ from the dynamics of response poems shared between authors who settled in the same places. Two ghazals, which are found in the Rampur and Qom manuscripts of the Divan of Haji Muhammad Aslam, help to elucidate this problem. I'm only going to be focusing on one of these today. Every line in this poem ends in Shab, tonight, a radif which had been popular since the 12th century and remained so in the long 17th century. Among the print published poets of the 17th century, ones like Idel, Jalal Asir, Sa'eb, Shapur, and Shafai all composed ghazals with this refrain, as did numerous authors whose collected works remain in manuscript. Now, these ghazals and Shab all bear a loose connection to one another through the use of common items of lexis and broad themes, but it is possible to distinguish more defined paraphrase networks of text, more defined paraphrase networks of text within this group, which exist in a closer emulative relationship. Paraphrase networks is an idea that I borrowed from Benedict Perry. More defined paraphrase networks of text within this group, which exists in a closer emulative relationship based on the use of at least several shared images and a dialogue in emotion and argument. Examining the course of 17th century, the corpus of 17th century ghazals ending in Shab becomes an experience of remembering and forgetting lines. A newly encountered apposite turn of phrase effaces and overwrites the old ones, seems to capture the core of the idea which the poets are collectively trying to bring across. Poems take on the quality of palimpsests, with layers of imagery developed by earlier members of the chain visible just beneath the surface of each text. The poem becomes what we might call the point of departure for its aesthetic effect. Salem's ghazals and Shab show the strongest connections to pieces by Saidi, Sa'eb, Shapur, and Bidel, and looser links to the poems of Jalal Asir, Atashi, Hadi, Mir Razi Danesh, and Nazem. but they clash quite jarringly with the pieces by poets such as Reza and Sadak Samet, which suddenly seem overtly neoclassical when side by side with them. Now, these poems all display strong intertextual links with one another, testifying to the high degree of connectivity in the circulation of Persian literary texts between Iran and India in the 17th century, which meant that poets who did not know one another were often able to access each other's work. Here is my translation of Salem's poem. It would be accurate to claim that they are evidence of a literary network in the sense of a sophisticated system for disseminating contemporary poetry internationally. Yet, despite their formal similarities, poets in different locations, that is, poets who, unlike Faraj Jalal Shushtari and Saleh Yazdi, were not collaborating with the community, each used circulating motifs to differing effect in their poems, building a separate argument and a contrasting emotional tone. I argue that these types of poems, which are comparable only on a formal level, should be distinguished from the nuanced debates over ideas that we find in the work of poets who inhabited the same spaces, who participated in the same political or social structures, and who corresponded with one another. The latter type of intertextual engagement is about the formation of a real community of shared interests. This is not what I see in this particular poem and poems that share the same radif. So, what does all of this mean? The poetry of this period is now largely forgotten and unstudied. And I think there's an obvious reason why the works of 17th century poets such as Faraj Jalal Shushtari and Salem and Salek have not been read or celebrated for over 300 years. They've been inaccessible. One could argue that this process of forgetting had already begun at the close of the 17th century. Some of the states in which the poets had worked were subsumed into others. The Qutb Shahi Sultanate, for example, was conquered by the Mughals. Manuscripts of poets' verse traveled far and wide, dispersing across the Arabian Sea through family networks in the book trade, leaving the communities in which the poets had established themselves, preventing scribes from collating and reissuing their texts. The situation became even more fragmented over the following centuries, as colonial regimes subsequently removed a significant body of this material to Europe, consigning it to an archive of Orientalist knowledge and effectively stripping it of its literariness. Physical inaccessibility, the relegation of text to the archive, was suddenly coupled with a form of intellectual inaccessibility. This material now belonged to history and was not supposed to have a bearing on literature's present or its future, even as it may yet have done. In their own time, however, 17th century poets were actually engaged in connecting their local communities with the transnational high culture, so building links between states. From Hyderabad to Mecca and Tabriz, poets active in Persian adopted shared approaches to intertextuality, which were based on the formation of emulative and masked links between new poems and the corpus. And yet we have to introduce a distinction between this adoption of common methods and the embrace of a single style. Many literary communities existed, and therein lay the undoing of the system. The literary genealogies and chains of pupillage in which writers found themselves were not universal, but equally they weren't national. Now, Rabindranath Tagore, his famous essay on the concept of world literature, which was first delivered as a lecture in 1907, ends with a call for us to recognize a, quote, totality in each particular work. Tagore meant totality in the sense of a timeless, universal feeling of humanity, but I want to suggest here a second linked concept, totality as the pluralistic poetic text which engages with the corpus as a whole. So I hope to have shown you today that, and in the book as well, that the pluralistic poem, with its layers of intertextual references extending across time and geographical space, was throughout the 17th century a key mechanism through which people around the Western Indian Ocean built links with one another. This material has as much to tell us about the construction of early modern Persianate societies, their self-representation and memorialization as documentary sources, narrative histories, works of intellectual history, and material objects. However, the only means by which we can perceive the globality of this poetry is by reading it. And to do that, we have to return to the manuscripts. So I'd like to encourage as many scholars as possible to read early modern Persian poetry, to study it, edit it, a rich and cosmopolitan body of literature which we neglect because of the boundaries, both intellectual and physical, that modernity has put in place. But I think it richly rewards study. So thank you very much.
Many thanks for that wonderful presentation, James, and many congratulations on publishing this fascinating book on Persian and Arabic literary communities. This is an immensely insightful contribution to contemporary scholarship on Arabic and Persian literature, on Middle Eastern, Persian, and South Asian literary cultures. So many congratulations, and thanks a lot for writing this richly detailed work.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Yeah, and I'm going to open the floor to the audience. Feel free to raise your hands or let me know. We have a small audience today, Ali and Keshav. If you have questions, do not hesitate to ask. I'll begin the discussion with a few questions about James' intellectual trajectory. This is, as you were talking and reflecting on how it takes a lot of work to go to different archives, collect all these manuscripts, and then start reading it. And one has to go through a kind of a intellectual journey, not just in getting the manuscripts, but also thinking about the research questions. And I wanted to ask you about how did you come across these questions? How was your own intellectual journey shaped in terms of the questions you were asking at the beginning and the questions you finally thought were worth responding to and that it deserved a monograph length response? Could you talk a little bit more about how did your research questions evolve over the years?
Oh, well, I mean, I've been working comparatively on Arabic and Persian biographical anthologies of poetry. I did my PhD, which looked at questions of circulation in the medieval period. I was using the work of two anthologists, Orfi, who Bob al-Bob is probably is the first extant biographical anthology of that survives. And Orfi was writing, he started his career in Central Asia, and then with the coming of the Mongols moved to what is now Pakistan. So his work inevitably engages with questions of the spread of literature beyond borders, particularly into Asia. I was also working with the Arabic anthology of Alabi, the Yatim al-Dar, which was compiled in Nishapur in Iran, but it's an Arabic work. So both texts really are about literature outside the confines of sort of national borders, what we think of as kind of the national homes of languages. So for me, this idea of transnational literature has been an inherent part of my work on Persian and Arabic. And it was really something kind of natural that I didn't have to think about too much. Also at the time working on reading communities, so how communities of readers in different territories and regions get exposed to literature and then respond and write their own poetry. So it's sort of it's all inherently about the spread of beyond borders. When I finished my PhD project, I thought that it would be a kind of important next step to look at the early modern period, primarily, I think, to interrogate these paradigms of decline, which have kind of persisted in scholarship on Arabic and Persian literature. I have to say that there is a lot more scholarship on early modern Persian literature, on Safavid Mughal poetry, for example, than there is on early modern Arabic literature. But it made sense to my mind to bring the two into a conversation with one another. I also felt it was an important next step because there is just so much early modern literature to study, which remains in manuscript, and I think it's incumbent on scholars to engage with that material. It's also such a rich period because there is so much material that our methods can be a lot more expansive. I think you would be extremely lucky to find something like the Jung of Fayaz, this notebook that I was showing in the talk for the medieval period. Such manuscripts very, very rarely survive, but there are many more for the early modern period. So the kinds of things that you can do and the kinds of questions that you can ask with the early modern texts are more expensive, let's say.
Thank you. That the other thing I really admired a lot in your writing in the book is how seamlessly you interweave a variety of critical concerns into your inquiry into the interconnected world of Arabic and Persian literature, particularly in regions where Arabic and Persian was not the vernaculars of the majority. You delve with Francesco Orsini's ideas on multilingual local. You delve with Y.J. DeMarc's understanding of deep time, Mohsen al-Musawi's understanding of communal and confederational republic of letters. So you are in dialogue with multiple disciplinary interlocutors while also preserving the integrity of Arabic and Persian studies. This is quite an accomplishment. I really appreciated the way you were able to navigate through this really rigorous and critical school of thinking. But I mean, I would like to invite you to share how you went about weaving together these diverse schools of critical thought. How did you plan your thought experiment? Were there some working principles? Are there some caveats? Are there some concerns that you would like to share with us so that specialists of Arabic and Persian literature can pursue similar thought experiments in the future?
Thank you for that. That's an interesting question. I think in a way it's really about the richness of the material and the number of approaches you can take, and all of these approaches have their own histories of scholarship. So you're forced to engage with a huge body of material. It's also about the diversity of the material itself and working on literatures in different states. Because I was constantly having to switch between studying the histories of different states. So I was inevitably working in this very interdisciplinary way, reading one thing on Mughal economic history or looking at lists of Mughal noblemen in order to try and find a patron, and then suddenly shifting for the chapter in Yemen and having to look at Zaydi conceptions of the imamate in order to understand what's going on in a particular panegyric poem. So I found it necessary to thematize my research, divide it into strands, and then to look for reading on overlapping topics. To give you an example, any consideration of migration demands some kind of engagement on globalization, also on the post-colonial because of regimes and their kind of influence on the formation of migrant communities. Engaging with the topic of migration also involves thinking about how people build new intellectual worlds and hence on world literature. So that's where, for example, the work of Emily Apter comes in. You've also got to think about time, as you say, and connections to the historical corpus, because so much of this poetry in both Persian in the 17th century is not just about intertextual engagement with the work of other 17th century poets, but with the whole, the corpus as a whole, stretching back years. So that's where the work of someone like Y.G. Dimmock comes in. And then I find myself having to conceptualize and to think about the system that the 17th century anthology was studying construct. And as I mentioned in the talk, they have this kind of global but not universal quality, i.e. literary dialogues the creation of literary dialogues is not open to everyone, but participants can be based anywhere. That makes sense. So I started having to think about communities and actually, what is a community and how inclusion and exclusion work. And that's why I brought in, like Jean-Luc Nancy. So kind of as a short answer to the question, it's really about categorizing the research that you're doing, trying to thematize it, and seeing what other scholarship is needed to fit those paradigms.
Thank you. That was very, very helpful. If anyone in the audience has questions, feel free to interrupt me. This is a fascinating work, and so I have hundreds of questions to ask James. And don't hold on if you have questions, and if you would like to ask something about James, I'm happy to take questions from the floor. Okay, as we move on, there's numerous critical issues that you delve with in your book. One of the key concerns about your reflections on migration and formation of community is the intertextuality itself. What exactly is intertextuality? And the study of intertextuality has a long history in modern scholarship. Most
Sure.
of the reflections on intertextuality tends to navigate between Julia Kristeva's formulation that kind of denies agency to creative writers, and on the other hand, we have Harold Bleem that tries to affirm the authorial agency and subjectivity and the anxiety of influence idea. In the realm of Persian studies and Arabic studies as well, we have issues of intertextuality being discussed at great length, but most of the reflections in Arabic and Persian traditions tend to focus on the intentional reuse of certain elements in the past, and then in some cases it's the jawab gui, it's the response to the previous generation or contemporary generations, or some kind of istiqbal or some kind of jawab gui. So these are the conversations that we have on intertextuality, and you recognize all of them, engage with them, but you also expose the limits of intertextuality as it has been understood in the past, and how this 17th century material. And I was thinking of the Jung of Fayaz when I was reading and reflecting on it. You show how older conversations on intertextuality has its own limits. And that is one of your major critical intervention in this work. I want to learn more about this. In what ways? How do you propose to revise the concept of intertextuality beyond what has already been said in the past?
Well, I don't think I'm necessarily trying to revise the concept of intertextuality itself. So these days, I think when people talk about intertextuality, they generally just mean, in a sort of general and non-specific sense, the illusion that one text is making to another, whether consciously or not. And we sort of this kind of contrast between the work of Julian Christopher and the work of Harold Bloom has sort of been smoothed over a bit. People recognize generally that you can deliberately make an allusion to another author's work, or you can do what Bloom calls misprision and misunderstand an early author's work, or you can inevitably just reproduce wording and phrasing that you've heard because that's how our brains work. But what I'm really interested in examining is not intertextuality as a purely, it sounds silly, but not intertextuality as a purely phenomenon. It's the social aspect of intertextuality. Why actually do we imitate? What is it about the social connections that we forge, friendships that we forge, the intellectual projects that we have, which mean that we want to, well, either want to deliberately mark an engagement with someone else's text, or are simply drawn to do it consciously because of the stuff that we're reading. And as you say, I think that's where something like the Jung of Fayaz really stands out, because he shows us exactly how social connections between people generate intertextuality. And this is the sort of paradigm that I've tried to follow throughout the book, really examining, using the manuscripts in a kind of very granular way to understand what happens when two people meet, poets meet and become friends, or become enemies, or simply get to know one another. How that affects their and at the end of the book, I explore the work of Salem. I was discussing in the talk. So this poet whose identity is questionable, but who seems to be the work. The divans that I have encountered by Salem seem to be the work of a Kashmiri poet called Haji Muhammad Aslam, who didn't actually know the poet's work I divan with. And that provides a kind of occasion to step back from examining the work of people who did know one another and say, well, what's the difference when a poet doesn't know his contemporaries? How does the use of intertextuality differ? And the main finding there is that there is this clear use of poetic images that is shared, the clear use of sort of formal devices, so that this sort of mechanical intertextuality, there isn't really the embrace of the same set of ideas, the same set of concepts, the attempt to actually establish a genuine dialogue that you find in the work of poets who did know one another. So that's really where I want to kind of push the study of intertextuality towards the social.
Fascinating. The other central concern throughout your writing was your reflections on world literature. In exploring the trans-regional formation of Arabic and Persian literary cultures, you are very attentive to the idea of world literature that has emerged in recent scholarship. You show that contemporary theorization of world literature is somewhat inadequate in appraising how 17th century poets like Al-Sarim, Al-Hindi, Al-Hur al-Amali, Faraj al-Shustari, and others were participating in that. This trans-regional formation affirms the presence of a a global or semi-global network. At the same time, it also questions the methodological or theoretical ways in which people have tried to conceive the idea of world literature. Could you elaborate more on this? Where do we go from here? How should we begin to, I mean, in some ways you talk about this towards the end when you were talking about Rabindranath Tagore, and in the book as well, you have a more substantial section as well. And I want to hear more as to how do you yourself broadly construe what can be understood as world literature. What are the theoretical underpinnings of it?
Well, I think in a way the problem is that, you know, the concept of world literature depends in part on there being national literature and borders. So, you know, in Demiroc's formulation, a world literature has escaped kind of the boundaries of the nation and global. But the early modern situation is actually rather different. It's about what Sanjay Subrahmanyam calls, you know, creative tensions in the use of multilingualism. So basically, you have states using different languages productively alongside one another. And perhaps instead of world literature, the term that I found the most useful when writing the book was globalizing. So when you actually think through the implications of that term, globalization is about concepts being applied globally across the world and appealing to people in other political dispensations, making other political dispensations cognate or similar in some way. So I think I would prefer to talk about this early modern literature as having this kind of globalizing quality, setting out to appeal to people trans-regionally, as opposed to being a world literature that has escaped from national borders because it's not tied to national borders.
That was quite helpful in terms of in shifting the focus from what is an object of world literature over the processes in which poets think about the world around them, not just locally, but globally. And so globalizing was, I mean, I constantly was looking at globalizing, and that made me really wonder about why you were using it. And it was it was a very helpful way of understanding the processes. There's always this tendency to, I mean, there has been a long history of critiquing nationalist historiography and breaking out of it. But then if the focus is just on identifying what existed as a global phenomenon, then we miss the really complicated everyday negotiation that goes in the process of connecting with the wider world. And therefore, I really found your emphasis on globalizing tendencies, globalizing profiles, much more helpful in terms of thinking about the processes of literary world making, processes of network building. So I'm really grateful to you for helping me understand that facet of early modern literary cultures. The other, an early modern literary historiography or early modern cultural historiography has had a lot of really interesting conversations in recent decades. You have mentioned Sanjay Subrahmanyam, but historians following Sanjay Subrahmanyam's lead with regards to what is a connected history, and kind of questioning the older models of comparative history. Historians of early modern South Asia have spent quite a lot of thought on the nuances of global connections in diverse contexts. And I want to bring here the scholarship of Zoltan Biderman, who studies the diplomatic encounters between Portuguese officials and Sri Lankan Kingdom of Kotte. And he argues that connection and disconnection often coexist in same space, in same time, in same social groups. at one level, and this is kind of evident in the material that he deals with, which is diplomatic agreement, where these communities are trying to force some kind of relation, but within that relationship, there's a lot of anxiety beneath the agreement itself, and there's a desire to disconnect, desire to control, desire to subjugate. And so what he ends up arguing is that while we understand connection, at the same time, we also have to look at the dynamics of disconnection, because they can coexist, they can be they can be operative at the same time. And I'm wondering if we think along with him in terms of understanding how literary processes are working, there are tendencies of localized histories as well. There are tendencies to create a world within the community, and
Yes,
not
absolutely.
and not go beyond the community, or sometimes the global can be threatening to the smaller community. And I'm wondering, uh, uh, how can we respond to him based on, the ideas of world literature that we just talked about? How would you I mean, you take a different route. You don't follow his route. You argue about, you recognize these challenges, and then you say that we should focus on the means by which a community is constructed and reconstructed. And so your focus is
Yes.
more on the process of construction of the community. Can I push you? And push is a very bad word, but can I ask you to argue for the advantages of this line of inquiry? How does this allow us to address a set of issues that would not otherwise be responded to if we were just focusing on connections and disconnections?
I think if we focus on connectivity and cohesion alone, we end up missing an awful lot of political history and how, moments at which states, or not even states, but actors, and actors, sometimes didn't actually want to connect with one another, or were trying to mark their distinction and their difference from one another, actually maybe agreed with one another. I think the basic point of to literature and ideas of the Republic of Letters is that the political and literary are really not the same thing, and there is always this, literature, no matter how worldly and how cosmopolitan, how globalizing it is always going to rub up against political structures, and we see that a lot in the kind of text that I've in the book and in early one in general, because so much of it is panegyric poetry and courtly poetry and poetry that is being written for political leaders. So there is this inherent tension in a lot of these poems between this globalizing aspect of invoking a corpus, a historical corpus, text that might have been produced by the states, text that might have been produced by the political enemies of the ruler for whom Britain, and at the same time crafting an ideology that is very specific and particular to the context of the working in. And I think actually probably one of the best examples of that is in my chapter on Yemen, where I examine a panegyric that was written by this poet called Assalam al-Hindi for Zaidi Imam, the ruler of Sana'a, where the poet himself is using a form, an imagery that had been pioneered at the beginning of the 17th century, and then much earlier in the 10th century by earlier poets who were also exploring relationships with their patrons. At the same time, though, Osodom al-Hindi is writing something very specific to the political context in which he's working, and he isn't necessarily well, it's complicated. He's doing two things at the same time. He's acknowledging the worldliness of his kind of genealogy, but at the same time, he's trying to do something very specific for his patron. So I think that's why I would tend to try and balance the study of connectivity with the study of next and differences between communities. And I think we have to bear that balance in mind.
That's very helpful. Thanks a lot. Masood, do you have a question?
Yeah, but may I have? Yeah, thank you very much. It was wonderful presentation and also the exchange of comments, from Pranav. Continuing on that, I'm fascinated to see that from the point of view of socio-political aspect of, this interchange and especially migration. Why do you think the 17th century became such a more or less very popular period of this kind of exchange, which you wouldn't find it in earlier period perhaps or later?
I think you find it. I mean, I wouldn't say that the 17th century is the sort of start of this. So, I think, as I mentioned in the talk, you have migration from Iran to India, and the migration of writers, from very early on, from the Ghaznavid period, at least. So, but I think what you do find, and the quantitative data shows that too, in the number of poets who are traveling, is that there is a high point, as you say, in the 17th century, and I think it's partly to do with the political circumstances and the fact that you have the Mughal Empire really in India, which becomes such an economic powerhouse. And then if you look at the economic history of the period, there's an awful lot of fluctuation. So the economy of Iran in this period is struggling. A lot of coinages devalued. So while there was very strong interest in poetry in Iran, as I say, and in Mashhad and all over the country, and there were plenty of patrons who were willing to pay for poetry, it suddenly became more economically feasible for talented poets to travel to India, because they could in real terms earn a lot more, and most of them knew that they were not going to go for life. They were going to make a trip, and then they were going to come back, and that might be how they would make their fortune. And you also think about coinage and the economic history of the period. In Golconda, for example, in the Hodshahi Sultanate of this period, you have a coinage that is still gold, the hoon. So if you were an Iranian and you were able to travel to Golconda and assemble a small pile of hoons, then you could bring them back to Iran, presumably with kind of free. When you got to a border, you would have to declare your coinage, but you would still be able to import your hoons, and presumably kind of for life. So as I say, I think it's mostly the economics of the period, and also the fact that there are so many different political dispensations that emerge in the 17th. It's before the kind of total Mughal control of India. So you have in the Deccan, you have sultanates, you have the so you have many different potential where poets can their luck. So it's the sort of the economics and the multiplicity of centers of really in this period of travel.
And also there is this triangle of political empires, Ottomans,
Yes, yeah,
and the Persians, Safavid,
yeah,
and also you
yeah.
have the Mughal, in India. So you have a kind of a sense of rivalry too, isn't it? That
Yes, absolutely. So as I was saying, there is this kind of free flow of people, but at the same time, you have very clearly articulated rivalries between these states. So there is always this tension between globalizing tendencies, if we want to call it that, and the boundaries that different dispensations or states set up with one another. But it's actually very productive in a way because people could still travel and might be encouraged because of circumstances in one state to move and go to another.
Mm-hmm. And you had also interesting historiographers, who recorded, these, for instance, divans or tazkaras and so on, and copied
Yes.
it. And
Yes.
then, they exchange that, this copying basically, or imitating, some of
Yes.
the manuscripts as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Masood, for that very interesting reflection on how the imperial milieu shaped the production of literature. And it was really helpful to one of the key focus of James's reflection, and James, correct me if I understood you wrongly, was the pluralistic nature of textual production and the multiple centers of patronage. For the final question, we are almost reaching close to our allocated time. I do want to talk, James, about your future prospects. One of the joys of doing research in humanities is that even while we satisfactorily include our responses to specific lines of inquiry, we are mindful of how complex inquiries inevitably has some loose ends that we hope to pursue in the future. Are there issues and questions that you are thinking of pursuing in the future? What's next for Dr. James White?
Sorry, Pranav, the connection went briefly then. Can you hear me?
Yeah. So yeah, I can hear you now, but we can't see you.
Okay.
Yeah, now we can see you. Yeah. And so my last question was really about what's next for Dr. James White after this amazing book where it's so richly detailed. And clearly, when we engage in so many people, so many texts, such a vast geographical expanse and such complex questions, we do answer certain specific lines of inquiry in a satisfactory manner, but we know that there are certain loose threads or there are certain questions that emerge during the research process that we want to pursue in the future. So we want to know what's coming next from you so that we can look forward to that.
Well, yes. So having written a book that really takes comparison between Arabic and Persian for granted, or at least not comparison, but the fact that Arabic and Persian texts were in the same spaces at the same time, I'm now really thinking about what it means to compose and read poetry in two languages, and to have a kind of comparative mindset that allows you to switch between two languages, in this case Arabic and Persian. So I'm writing a book on late medieval and early modern comparison, what it meant for someone in the medieval world to have, two different languages and two different mental worlds at their disposal. And I'm trying to think about what it what medieval and early modern methods and bilingual can teach us in the present, and specifically what we can teach comparators who try to deal with comparison. Comparative literature as a discipline is new. It's a 19th century invention, but at the same time, it's much older than an ancient lineage. And I think that opening comparison as a discipline up to the global south and thinking about how people in the medieval period in, for example, Iran, thought about comparing or approached comparison will help us deal as we sort of reformulate the discipline.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. This was brilliant.
Fascinating presentation, and thank you, Pranav, for navigating the whole discussion and this lively discussion, and it was wonderful. And it's a great pity, of course, that we didn't have a wider audience, but never mind. I think the quality is the question here, that it has been beautifully addressed. And also, hopefully, the recording of this can be accessible to people who are interested and they couldn't attend. And may I thank you so profoundly again, James, for this great presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
For conducting the discussion. And I'm very interested to, I started to read your book, but I have to, it has given me more incentive to go deeper into to reading it properly, and follow it up. Yes. And thank you again. And it was great to meet you both.
Thank you. It's been wonderful to take part.
Thank you. Okay.
See.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye. You too.
Bye.